So in my previous series on Khabib and Conor, I explored how Khabib's intensely disciplined lifestyle was matched up against McGregor's wildly free creativity. Of course, we saw how that played out. Ultimately, Conor's creativity was hampered by a lack of preparedness. One might even say a lack of discipline when facing the iron will of Khabib. Conor commented after the fact that he had focused too much on defensive wrestling and would have been more effective if he had used his striking offense. In that previous series, I also covered how Khabib's discipline reminded me of Confucius. Let's quickly recap Confucian philosophy. Confucius came up during a period of civil unrest in Chinese history called the Warring States period, and during this time he saw how the competition for more power and wealth among the rulers of these lands caused civil unrest and disharmony among all social tiers in society. He concluded that when the rulers were brash and selfish and unethical, the peasants would surely follow their example. Confucius built a philosophical system which addresses these issues. We'll focus on three of the core ideas. First, education. He taught that all people should concentrate their efforts on studying the ways and teachings of the ancient sages. Through education, every person could better be equipped to replicate the harmony of the glorious kingdoms of the past. Second, Li, ritual. By studying the harmonious practices of the past, one could then grasp what they should be doing in the present. This meant that everything that one does in daily life has an appropriate behavior behind it. Lastly, Ren, benevolence. Confucius argued that what held this whole system together was an undying commitment to the well-being of others. Of course, for Confucius, a person was not being measured according to their individuality or prowess or special gifts. They were instead required to exercise extreme discipline in pursuit of a perfect performance befitting their quote-unquote name. And by name, he means everything from their family name, which contains any title or high station, as well as their function or role in society, from farmers to kings. A person was given a role by destiny, and it was their fundamental duty to uphold the responsibilities of that duty or task, or risk driving society as a whole into chaos. It's also worth mentioning that destiny back then doesn't really mean destiny in the sense of one's calling. Rather, destiny is the unfathomable Tao of the universe, which ascribes to everyone a job to do and no real way to change or even understand it. So, in short, the philosophical virtues of Confucianism align extremely well with the attitude and approach of Khabib. Speaking of virtues, one more philosophical figure to mention in this discussion of discipline, Aristotle, the student of Plato, is believed by many to be the originator of value theory, especially virtue ethics, due to his emphasis on virtue in the Nicomachean Ethics. Now, virtue for Aristotle related to the virtuous life, a holistic approach to well-being and self-fulfillment he called eudaimonia. And he wasn't referring to specific virtues like courage or intelligence, although these were definitely part of it. For Aristotle, the idea was to recognize how a successful person put all of the independent virtues together into a person of upstanding moral character, and then to constantly practice the habits and lifestyle of that person until eventually you took this nature upon yourself. Basically, he taught fake it until you make it by repetition and constant practice. But is it really fair to call this behavior false when the point is to exhibit this behavior until it becomes natural? The point is to instill within yourself the disciplines and practices necessary to become the person you want to be. I mean, think about it. This is precisely what training to fight is all about. A person becomes so conditioned to perform the right behaviors in a fight situation that they do not have to think about what they should be doing. Discipline for Aristotle, like Confucius, was a method of practicing and perfecting the kind of life you wanted to live for ultimate fulfillment. Hopefully you can see how these thinkers overlap with a person like Khabib. Through an unwavering duty to his roles and responsibilities, Khabib has created himself into an undeniable force of nature. He has been faithful to his commitment to family, faith, and constant commitment to self-improvement as an athlete and mixed martial artist. He played the role of dutiful and respectful son, and upon the unfortunate passing of his father, he's prepared, I'm sure, to carry on the legacy of his family name, his role and duty because of his constant self-discipline and self-improvement. And a final note on Khabib worth mentioning is that this level of discipline and self-sacrifice has to be incredibly uncomfortable to a lot of people in the West. Why is that? Because the European Enlightenment ideals that reach into the contemporary First World were all grounded in notions of intellectual maturity and freedom. Although self-discipline is fine, to devote oneself entirely to the traditions and teachings of a religion or ruling class, or to one's family or career, is wholly unconscionable to our Western sensibilities. Kant argued that the Enlightenment was marked by philosophy's efforts to goad people on and the escape from nonage or intellectual and ethical immaturity. There is a sense of literal anarchy involved in the formation of these ideals. No leader or authority should suppress your voice or thoughts, nor should they tell you what to think. On the other hand, however, I think that it is precisely what makes Khabib's fans beyond the Western world so emphatic in their support. Khabib represents an undeniable example of the benefits of self-sacrifice and commitment to ideals that you inherit, rather than absolute individual freedom. To do what he has done through dedication and submission to his beliefs, culture, and religion truly realizes the pinnacle of human achievement in this particular rational system. So Confucius or Aristotle would approve. If the West values individual freedom above all else, then what can be a universally shared principle or trait for the West? The answer is that there can't be one, because freedom means to each their own, and this must include even the freedom to believe in whatever religious system you choose. Of course, every professional athlete is disciplined, and to be a professional MMA fighter likely requires the highest level of discipline of any athlete, so I'm not trying to take anything away from the rest of the roster by emphasizing Khabib's iron resolve when it comes to self-discipline. I am suggesting that this is his strongest asset as a fighter. Now that said, among the fighters in the 155 division, Gaethje may be one of the most closely matched to Khabib's level of discipline, and this is due in fact that he has been a wrestler since he was a really little kid, like around 4 or 5, and has openly said that he has been continually pushed to his own limits both in fights and practices as a wrestler. So for these reasons, he believes that he has the capability to overcome every circumstance, including what Khabib has to offer. If we think about it, this makes perfect sense. Being disciplined is ultimately about pushing oneself to the threshold of capability. For example, in the Confucian sense, any deviation to one's place and function in society risks the whole system devolving into disharmony. In the Aristotelian sense, a lack of discipline will result in one denying their own eudaimonia, or self-fulfillment. These setbacks may take a very long time to overcome and should be avoided at all costs. But there is a difference to Justin Gaethje's discipline from nearly everyone else. He has stated that he is motivated by entirely different goals and fears than others. For example, in a recent interview with Kevin Aioli, he was asked,
what about, when did you feel as a pro fighter that, you finally weren't just a strong dude with big dense bones, that, you had good technique and that, that you actually were good at this sport?
I can't allow myself to think that, the way I fight, I've been telling myself every day that Khabib's gonna, make me look like a bitch, and that he's gonna take my life from me. So that's how I do it. That's how I get ready for occasions like this. I told myself Tony was gonna make me look like that. He was gonna embarrass me, and then I went out there and did what I did, and I was absolutely surprised every time. Every time when I knocked out Edson Barboza, I was so surprised.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I think I do it a little different than most.
if you followed MMA at all, you get the sense that fighters have absolute confidence in their abilities, often to their own peril. Just look at Gerald Meerschaert's recent KO loss to Khamzat. Meerschaert was adamant that he was being overlooked and it would play to his own advantage, but he was very, very wrong. Announcers often say that nobody gets into the ring thinking that they will lose because seriously, why would you get into a fight that you couldn't win on purpose? But this is essentially what Gaethje is saying. He throws himself into situations that he expects to be hopeless and surprises himself when he performs well and wins. So what's going on with this guy that he throws himself into fights this way? Is he crazy? Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, I find it special, even admirable, that Gaethje's philosophical dimension is that he's a bit of a nihilist, absurdist when it comes to fighting. It is not a rational decision to go into a contest that you expect to lose. This would be what Kant would call
totally freaking nuts.
A deliberate choice that anyone makes should appeal to the standards of reason. Doing something that you expect to be harmful to yourself is not just ill-advised, but it's actually demonstrating serious flaws in your intellectual maturity. I mean, unless, of course, one could find a legitimate rational justification for such a choice. That's just it. I don't think Gaethje is flawed or irrational. I also don't think that Gaethje is just trying to trick himself into believing he's insufficient so that he'll train harder, although that's probably part of it. But what I really think that this says is that it exposes how Gaethje actually recognizes the inherent absurdity of fighting as a career, and he throws himself into danger because deep down, violence represents one of the most primal absurdities of our existence, which is, at the same time, always possible. I'm not a fearmonger who's trying to say that everyone needs to train or own weapons because bad people are lurking around every corner. The idea that I get from Gaethje's approach isn't even fear. It's much more cerebral than that. It's the inherent openness of possibility which makes MMA so exciting to watch. Khabib is a 28-0 fighter who is in his prime. If ever there was a foregone conclusion in sports, it's a Khabib fight. Nevertheless, we fans pay money to watch these events play out on the off chance that something unexpected or unpredictable will happen. If sports were 100% predictable, there'd be no reason to play them. And some of the greatest moments in sports history are upsets, when a team or athlete who is expected to lose pulled out the win against all odds. I think this is what Gaethje launches himself into with every fight. The unlikely possibility of success. And to meet the competition head on, he not only prepares for the worst, he brings the most violent response he can conjure. Why? Well, I don't think the answer is that Gaethje wants to prove what a badass he is. He's done enough of that already. I think that to rationalize throwing himself into the insanity and chaos of fighting, Gaethje wants to enjoy it, like we the fans do. He doesn't want to know what is about to happen, or make predictions, or outcomes. He wants to face down the demons of ultra-violence and test himself. Philosophically, this approach is marked, in my opinion, by nihilism. Now, there are several types of nihilism, but the most basic definition is the general belief that there are no universal underlying truths that tie what we humans think about reality to what is real. Life, the universe, and everything, it has no inherent purpose to it. One might even go so far as to say that there is no real apart from what humans recognize as the real. A primary figure of this view was Immanuel Kant, who argued that what the really real might be was impossible for we humans to deduce because, by default, we can only understand the world as humans. What is odd about this way of thinking in a fighter is that one of the most commonly used responses to basic nihilism is the claim that reality can be proven according to material realism. There is a real world right in front of your face which can be used as an objective basis for truth. Gaethje, on the other hand, faces the real head-on, not as a figment of material realism, but as a feature of the open possibility in the spaces between what we think we know and what actually occurs on a certain occasion, as he calls it. So what gets me so excited about this approach is the level of purity that this exposes in Gaethje's thoughts. For a philosophical corollary, I would argue that Gaethje is staring into an abyss that few, if any, other fighters allow themselves to face. Gaethje approaches fights in a Nietzschean perspective. In his book, Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche famously stated, "Whoever fights with monsters should see to it that he does not become one himself. And when you stare for a long time into an abyss, the abyss stares back into you." Nietzsche published this work around the same time as his other book on the genealogy of morality in around 1886 or 1887. And this was during an intense dive into the nature and origins of value theory, upon which ethics and morality are based. He concludes from this that all societies rely upon an underlying set of principles in order to determine what has value for that society. Hence, what makes someone's behavior good or bad is not dependent upon a set of universal fundamental truths that are inherent to the universe. But instead, they depend upon systems of shared beliefs or ideas which determine for people what good and bad are. So Nietzsche is often called a nihilist because he does not believe that anything in particular is good or bad, right or wrong, or true or false. Folks who make this claim about Nietzsche, however, often neglect his follow-up argument that the last thing anyone should do is to abandon morality or abandon belief or meaning. Rather, he thinks that folks should be inventing their own morality, such that others will wake up from their own herd mentality and begin to think for themselves, which is kind of similar to Kant, but with refinements. So with this as a backdrop, when we look at the Nietzsche quote, we can place it in a little better context. I would argue that at least part of the point he is making is that when we reach the realization that reality and morality are not nailed down to any underlying truth or system of inherent organization, we're facing the monster or abyss of meaningless nothingness. So when one fights a monster like that, they may become the monster if they have no response. They may become meaningless nothingness if that's all they believe is there. If one gazes into the abyss of meaningless nothingness, they run the risk of never again finding meaning, descending into truly absurdist, pessimistic nihilism. Like Nietzsche, Gaethje gazes into the abyss of meaningless violence by carrying all of his insufficiencies with him, so honestly, knowing that he will lose or be embarrassed, knowing that there is nothing that he brings with him that will guarantee success or explain an underlying purpose or meaning to this that he is subjecting himself to. All he can do is allow himself to be tested, to throw himself into the fires of possibility and emerge changed as a kind of Nietzschean Ubermensch, the Superman who faces the abyss and returns from it reborn.